Once upon a time, Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people lived peacefully together in what is now known as the Holy Land. But that is all gone to shit. Hello all, my name is Yasmin, but everyone calls me Yaya, and today we will be talking about why it's so controversial to call yourself a Palestinian. I'll be getting into if Palestinians actually have a legitimate claim to the Holy Land, where the word Palestinian came from, along with who the rulers and inhabitants were in this region throughout history, and I'll be talking about all of this while I do my makeup. So unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably already heard about the Israel-Palestine conflict. And you've probably heard it coupled with the argument that the Jews and the Arabs have been fighting for hundreds and hundreds of years to no avail, and that there's just no simple solution. But the thing is, that's just not entirely true. You see, in the beginning, there was Adam, and then there was Eve. At least that's what some people believe. I'm sorry, that was very cringe. But my point is that people account for history in a way that they believe in. So everyone kind of has their own version of history, according to their religious beliefs or what have you. But luckily we have archaeologists who can get down to the bottom of what we need to know by using cold, hard evidence that isn't really coupled with a lot of bias, or at least as little bias as humanly possible. So I think it's appropriate to use that evidence to get to the bottom of what we're trying to figure out regarding Palestinian legitimacy to this land and much more. And you know your girl already came with the sources. So to understand if Palestinians really came from Palestine, we can look at several factors. The first is the overall history of the region, including who inhabited it and who ruled it. So let's start from the beginning, which is the late Bronze Age. And that was between 1550 to 1200 BCE. Now there are people called the Canaanites who are believed to be the first settlers there. They established city-states which were influenced by Egypt, and during this era this region was referred to as Peleset or Ritenu. Now I'm likely butchering the name, but it's important to know what the names of these regions were, and I'll get into why later. And then we have the Iron Age, which existed from 1200 to 539 BCE. And this was a period of the Israelite kingdoms, and there was also a people known as the Philistines who inhabited the southern coast of the region. Now the Philistines were people with Aegon origin, and no, not the guy from Game of Thrones. The Philistines are referenced in the Bible as these invasive sea people from the Aegon Sea who would harass the Egyptians and the Canaanites. However, archaeologists have found no evidence of a violent invasion from the Philistines, and I'll get into this in another video. But basically, archaeologists found that the Philistines assimilated very quickly with the existing culture that was in the land. Now, additionally, the Philistines are believed to have settled in the land at the same time as the Israelites, which I mentioned during the Iron Age. And although the name Philistines sound like the Arabic word for Palestine, which is Philistine or Philistini, DNA studies of the Palestinian people living today do not show a direct descendant from those Philistines, like from those people. So they're not genetically related. The Philistines are actually believed to have gone extinct. Now the DNA of the Palestinians today show that they are descendants of the Canaanites, which again is the earliest group of people living in this region during the Bronze Age. Okay, so now that we've cleared that all up, let's move on to the rulers of each era in this region. And I just want to let you guys know, I don't have my concealer with me. I'm not home right now, and my makeup might look crazy, so don't be scared. Okay, so during the Iron Age, this region was conquered by several different empires, including the Assyrians in the 8th century BCE, the Babylonians in 601 BCE, and the Persians in 539 BCE. And at this time, the region was known as Palashtu or Palistu. And then we have the Hellenistic period, which was between 332 to 63 BCE. And this is when Alexander the Great conquered the area and introduced Hellenization to the region. Now, Hellenism suppressed Jewish practices. They did this by outlawing circumcision and also desecrating the temple in Jerusalem. And at this time, the Jewish people did have some sort of sovereign rule and a kingdom called Judea. But there was also still assimilation between the Jewish people and the Greeks. And once Alexander the Great fell, the Seleucid Empire rose to power, and I'm probably butchering the name. Now this empire continued to enforce Hellenism. And again, Hellenism was influenced by Greek culture, not Arab or Muslim culture / religion. Now, of course, the Jewish people did not like that their practices were being suppressed, so they revolted. And the Jewish people were led by Judas Maccabeus in what was known as the Revolt of the Maccabees or the Maccabean Revolt. And this led to the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem. And the Jewish people today commemorate this event through the holiday known as Hanukkah. Okay, so after this victory, then the Hasmonean dynasty began to rule, and the Jewish people had sovereign rule. And the rulers of the Hasmonean dynasty were descendants of the Maccabee family. Now, this was the second time that the Jewish people had self-governance. However, once the Romans came, that came to an end. And at first, the Jewish people resisted assimilation, but eventually they really didn't have a choice, and that led to a Jewish province or unofficial state in the area that was ruled by the Romans. Okay, now so this region then became known as Judea, which was again a province of Roman rule. And at this time, the names Palashtu and Palistu from the 8th century BCE rule were carried over into Greek and appeared in the histories of Herodotus in the 5th century BCE as Palestine. Then in 132 CE, during the Bar Kokhba revolt, the province was expanded and was renamed Syria Palestina. And then the region came under Byzantine control and then became a majority Christian. And then in 390 CE, the Byzantine Empire split the region into 3 parts, or 3 provinces, known as Palestina Prima, Palestina Secunda, and Palestina Tertia. Then came the early Muslim period, and then Palestine was conquered by the Muslim Rashidun Caliphate, and that region was ruled by various dynasties. And then following the Muslim conquest of the Levant in the 630s, the military district of Jund Philistine was established. And for those of you who don't know, Philistine it means Palestine in Arabic, not to be confused with the biblical Philistines again. And then the Crusades began in 1099, with Christian armies in the region conquering and taking over. And then there was the Ottoman period, where the region came under Ottoman rule until the end of World War I. And then finally we have the British Mandate for Palestine, which was established in 1920 and granted Britain administrative control of the region. So why is there such controversy about the term Palestinian or Palestine? Well, there's a common argument that Palestinians never had a Palestinian king, so that there can't be a Palestine, or that you can't find Palestine on the map, or that there is no P in the Arabic language. And to all those points, we can say a few things. First off, the first Palestinian president was Yasser Arafat, and he became president after the Palestinian Declaration of Independence was established, and Palestine actually has an official president today whose name is Mahmoud Abbas. Okay, now throughout Palestine's history, there have been Christian rulers, Muslim rulers, and Jewish rulers, and under every single rule, the land had a specific name, which I told you about earlier, and all those names evolved into what we now know as Palestine. And research shows that these names represent a continuous linguistic evolution rather than unrelated or random terms, and that the names also represent cultural and linguistic exchanges. So let's go over it again. Egyptian inscriptions show that the earliest name was Paleset. Then Assyrian monuments show that there were variants of the name Palashtu. Then the Romans show records using the name Palestina. And then when the Muslims came, they had a military district known as Jund Philistine. And again, Philistine is the Arabic way to say Palestine, which is why the argument that there is no P in the Arabic language is so funny, because the Arabic alphabet is not the same as the English alphabet. So there doesn't need to be a P in the Arabic language for the name Philistine and Palestine to both exist and to both be legitimate. Okay, now the other arguments are that you can't find Palestine on a map, but here are some maps, both historically and in modern times, that show Palestine on a map. And then another common thing that people like to say is that the majority of the world acknowledges what is Palestine as all Israel. But the truth is 147 of the 193 UN member states acknowledge Palestine as a state. And that makes up about 75% of the international community. So the majority of the world actually recognizes Palestine, not the contrary. Okay, now let's talk about legitimacy of Palestinians to the land. And if you guys are asking why I'm even talking about this in the first place, I just got so much controversy on one of the posts that I put on Instagram, which you should all follow me on, and TikTok as well. And there are many people saying that there is no Palestine, that Palestinians don't have a legitimate claim to land, yada, 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 which is why I made this video. Okay, now let's get into it. So international law, right, if we want to acknowledge that, which I don't see why we wouldn't, recognizes indigenous rights to a land and recognizes a valid claim to the land based off of frameworks like the International Covenant of Political and Civil Rights. And they don't recognize right to a land or right to self-determination on the basis of if the indigenous people had a king in the land or a documented king in the land. Additionally, archaeological research shows that Palestinians have significant connections to ancient Levantine populations, with studies showing continuous habitation patterns in the region. And scientific research show that Palestinians share a lot of DNA with people from the ancient Levantine populations and the Canaanites, who I mentioned were the earliest settlers of the land. Okay, now specifically, they found that Palestinians today share 50% DNA with Canaanites, and anthropological studies show the preservation of Palestinian identity across generations in both refugee populations and those who still remain. So Palestinians have been developing Palestinian identity by preserving their culture. And really the only reason why any of this is up for debate is because of recent events or events in modern history, like the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which set up competing national claims and began the marginalization of Palestinian aspirations for like self-determination and claims to the land. And during the British Mandate period, tensions grew as more Jewish immigrants began to settle in the land and Palestinians began to feel dispossessed of their land, and they were really not happy being under the British. And then the Nakba happened in 1948, which was the displacement of 750,000 plus Palestinians and the creation of Israel. And all of these events combined are the reason why so many people debate Palestinian legitimacy and their claim to the land. Now, beyond that, there's also political dimensions that contribute significantly to the stigma, like factors related to international relations and recognition of Palestine as a state or the sovereign people, and also the complex governance structure of Palestine, right? So there's Hamas and Fatah, and then Hamas ruled over Fatah in around 2006, and that complicated Palestinian unity and politics because there's like a divide between the West Bank governance and then Gaza's governance. And this also led to an oversimplified and negative portrayal of Palestinian sovereignty and the Palestinian people as a whole. US policy influence is also a major factor, as American support for Israel has significantly shaped global perspectives, which often resulted in policies and narratives that marginalize Palestinian perspectives, and the media plays a big part in this. For example, whenever something happens in Palestine, instead of calling the West Bank what it is, which is occupied territories, they will call them disputed territories, suggesting that there is an equal fight over the West Bank and not the reality, which is that it's under total military occupation under Israel. Okay, and then there's also like selective reporting, which favors Israeli narratives. And then there's also the lack of historical context regarding reporting. So if Hamas strikes, there's seldom context of when that started, why it happened, and kind of like the full picture, though we are seeing a shift right now. There's also a lot of dehumanization of Palestinians, a lot of attacks on Palestinian character, and claims about inability for them to govern themselves as a reason for the violence that they're subject to by Israel. And there are often a lot of double standards in reporting when it comes to Palestinian casualties versus Israeli casualties, and there's a disproportionate focus on Palestinian violence over the humanitarian crisis that Palestinians face. And for a very long time, Palestinian journalists did not have the ability to share their perspectives with the world until now, when so many people have tuned into the voices from actual Palestinians on the ground in Palestine. Okay, so all of these factors combined have led to the reason why people find it controversial to call themselves a Palestinian, or why people think it's controversial for people to say that they're Palestinian. However, with the advancement of social media especially, things are changing and people are being introduced to Palestinian voices and viewpoints, which is changing the narrative a lot. And there are also so many global solidarity movements that have formed to show support for the Palestinian cause and for Palestinian sovereignty. And we are finding more and more people who are open to embracing Palestinian identity as legitimate, and many of those who don't really acknowledge all of the things that I've just shared with you. Okay, so that was a lot to unpack, and I hope that you all learned something. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up, comment, share, subscribe, or just let me know what your thoughts on the topic are. I love conversing with you all and building this community. I've seen so much solidarity, and I feel so much support from everyone in this community who care about the Palestinian cause. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, and I'm relatively new to YouTube, but I love making these in-depth videos, and I would love to know what you all would like to hear about next. Any specific regions outside of the Middle East, within the Middle East, whatever it is, any topics, I would be more than happy to explore those. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, all sources in the comments.